The Triathlon Show 399. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode we have another Q&A. This one is on the topic of racing and the topic of testing. And I want to start with one general comment. I was quite surprised by the lack of questions, or the few questions we got about racing. Just my subjective experience as a coach and as an athlete is that probably most people don't have racing completely figured out. And in fact, a lot of people have a lot to gain by becoming better racers, and probably much more so than by finding a better testing protocol than what they are currently using. Of course, this doesn't apply to everybody, but it's just something to think about in general, that it's pretty easy to miss the forest for the trees sometimes when we're trying to leave no stone unturned to train better and get fitter, and doing better testing is part of that, of course. But at the end of the day, the majority of athletes would want to train better and get fitter so that they can perform better on race day. And I think that a lot of athletes just have huge untapped potential in improving their racing craft. So that's the point I want to make, and something to think about. Maybe it doesn't apply to you at all, but for some people it might, and it might be something that you can think about. If this applies to you, how can I improve my racecraft? So anyway, maybe I'll send out another request for racing related questions sometime next year for a new Q&A, and hopefully by then we will get a lot more questions on that topic, because we only had half a handful now, but we do have a bunch of questions still, and this episode goes on for more than an hour, so there's lots of content still, and hopefully you enjoy this Q&A. But let's thank our sponsors, Form. The Form Smart Swim Goggles give you real-time feedback in your swim training right on the goggle lens, including splits, pace, stroke rate, and heart rate. This means that you can execute your swim workouts a lot better, whether it's about pushing harder when you're starting to fall off the pace or holding back when you're accidentally going faster than you should. It also means that you don't need to use your GPS watch in the pool. You can automatically get the start and stop and of course the time of each split, because the goggles will automatically detect that and give you really accurate splits. And even more importantly, perhaps, they add some fun and motivation, because it becomes so much more engaging when you get that real-time feedback in your swimming than when you have to wait until the end of the length or end of the interval, I should say, to get any kind of feedback. You can get 15% off the goggles with the code TTS15 on formswim.com/TTS. And thank you to Zen8. The Zen8 indoor swim trainer allows you to improve your technique, power, and swim training consistency even when you're short on time. It's a great tool for busy athletes because you can do a quality workout in just 15 minutes at home, even on days when you don't have time to get to the pool. It is a perfect complement to pool and open water swimming because it allows you to focus specifically on key aspects of your swimming, like your catch and your power, and you can isolate these more easily than you can in the water. You can try the Zen8 risk-free for up to 30 days, so if you don't love it, just send it back, and you can get 20% off your first order on zen8swimtrainer.com/TTS. Now, without any further ado, let's get into the Q&A. The first question for today is from Matthew, who asks, I have a fairly aggressive bike position that I can hold for a 70.3. However, I noticed on my first race of the season that on the run, my breathing was shallow and painful, possibly because my diaphragm was somewhat blocked from the bike position. Does that seem likely, and what would you advise to do to limit it? So first of all, I do think that an aggressive bike position could have that impact on the respiratory system. It doesn't mean necessarily that in this case it absolutely was, that there are no other options, but yes, it could have that effect. When we talk about the respiratory system, something that a lot of people don't think about is that it can be quite a bit more influential in endurance performance than it is often given credit for. Firstly, the respiratory system needs a relatively large energy supply during exercise, and any energy that goes to the respiratory system, of course, is energy that cannot go to the locomotor muscles. So in other words, the economy of the respiratory system is important. If we can have it be functional and work with using less energy, then that's energy that we can use to move forward faster. And this is something that varies, the economy of the respiratory system, that is, from person to person. but it can also vary based on things like being in an aggressive aero position versus a less aggressive position, or even sitting upright on, let's say, in a road bike position. Things like wearing a wetsuit might also impact the economy of the respiratory system. So there's a lot of things there to consider. But more than just the economy factor, and more importantly, is that over extended durations of exercise, the respiratory system can fatigue. And that too is likely to be impacted by something like an aggressive aero position. So the primary thing that I would recommend to mitigate the issue, which could potentially be this kind of respiratory system fatigue, is that making sure that you have enough training that approaches race demands, so that you can, first of all, train the respiratory system in addition to the cardiovascular and musculoskeletal system, and make sure that it's ready for these demands. So that means doing race simulation workouts, a hard bike with a good amount of race intensity work in the race position, and then doing a run off the bike at race pace. And if you then notice that even with training, with repeating that a few times, that the issue is still very significant and you don't seem to get better necessarily in terms of the respiratory discomfort that you experienced, then at that point, maybe consider adopting a less aggressive position if that is the case. So that would be my primary recommendation, to just look at specific training and see if that helps the issue, which it very well could do. But if it doesn't, then I would say that changing your bike position as a first step would be my recommendation. Even if you do switch to a less aggressive position on the bike in the short term, you can still do things that might allow you to hold that more aggressive position longer term. So one of them would be to focus on your breathing mechanics, making sure that you're really breathing from the diaphragm and expanding your rib cage as you inhale, trying to take deep breaths and maintaining a consistent respiratory frequency, consistent but not too fast and shallow hyperventilating. And secondly would be a bit more high-tech, but there is some evidence to suggest that various respiratory training methods and devices can improve endurance performance. Without going too deep into this, there are mainly two types of devices. There are those that provide resistance during inhalation, and examples of that would be PowerBreathe and AeroFit. And then there are devices that are made for what's called voluntary isocapnic hyperpnea, which basically allows you to breathe without resistance, but with constant CO2 levels, and you provide the training stimulus based on how vigorously you breathe and the respiratory frequency and duration of training. And examples of these kinds of devices would be the Breathe Way Better device and the Spiro Tiger. And I have used the Breathe Way Better a bit. It's a cool device. I have not used it enough to really gauge any effects of the training, so can't comment on that from personal experience. But that is something that down the line you could potentially look at as an adjunct to your normal training, but potentially also while you're training in the aero position. That would be on the trainer, not out on the road, but to really challenge the respiratory system and make it adapt. Going into the evidence of these devices beyond the scope for today, but it is something that I hope to do in a future episode, and hopefully with an expert on that topic in that case. But either way, I would come back to the points that I made first or earlier here, that it's first and foremost about just making sure that you done significantly challenging race simulation training with a hard bike in the aggressive position and running off the bike, and only if you do that and your breathing continues to be an issue, that is when you really might need to start looking into other aspects of, well, first of all, positional changes on the bike, but also maybe if you should consider doing something specific with the respiratory system, whether it be biomechanical changes or even respiratory training. I hope that this helps, and I hope that you can resolve your issues and have a great season going forward. The next question is from Henry, who asks, what are the biggest gains one can make during race week? So my answer to this one is maybe a little bit cheeky, but I'd say it's to not F things up in training and doing too much. with all the usual caveats, and it depends, generally I do think that less is more in race week, both when it comes to intensity and volume, and especially when we're talking longer races, so like let's say longer than 2 hours, which for most age group athletes is anything from Olympic distance and up. So to give you an idea, for an athlete training, let's say 15 hours per week normally, I think most people would do well with averaging around 1 hour or just below 1 hour of training per day in race week. And that might mean doing a couple of 1 hour, 15-minute days early on in race week, and then just 45 minutes in the middle and 30 minutes later on in the race week, something like that. So really not doing too much is number one. By the way, those hours, so those 1 hour, 15 minutes might still look like a 40-minute swim and a 35-minute run or something like that. It might still be 2 workouts per day. I do believe in generally maintaining frequency of training, but it just means really, really short workouts generally. So yeah, again, summary, don't do too much, neither volume nor intensity. The second one that I would say, and it is a big one, it is sleep. I really think that if you give yourself 1 hour more sleep opportunity per night, that can make an amazing difference, especially if you're normally on the low end of the recommended range. So let's say you're normally getting 7.5 hours of sleep per night, and you go to 8.5 hours per night. You will feel like $1 million, generally speaking, at least. That is what I've seen. And this is another reason why going quite low volume on training in race week is beneficial, because it does give you, and we're talking amateur athletes here, it does give you that extra time that you need to up your sleep, because of course time is limited, you still have work to do, family demands and so on. But if you, instead of training 1.5 hours in the morning, suddenly you're training 40 minutes in the morning, then maybe you can go to bed 15 minutes earlier in the evening, and suddenly you easily have that extra hour that you want to add to your sleep. And I would start with this from the very first day of race week. I think that that's a good routine. The third one is nutrition. So carb loading 1 to 2 days before, and I personally prefer 2 and generally recommend 2 days of carb loading. Some people, notably Tim Podlogar, who I had on the podcast and who is absolutely fantastic, he had some good arguments for just doing 1 day of carb loading. If you do just 1 day of carb loading, I would front load the carbs to get most of them earlier in the day rather than later. And I would make sure, be really diligent with counting the carbs to make sure that you get 10 to 12 grams of carbs per kilogram body weight. For a 2-day carb load, the advantage to me is that, first of all, you just have a little bit of an extra buffer. So even if you maybe miscalculate some things, you have already topped up your glycogen stores reasonably well from the first day of the carb load. And even if the second day, maybe you get a bit less than you ideally wanted, but that might be enough to get to that completely 100% replenished point anyway. So it's just having some safeguards, really. But also for a 2-day carb load, the first of the 2 days, you don't have to think anything about front loading. For the second day, I would still do that to make sure that you don't have to just stuff yourself in the afternoon and evening before the race, because that just feels quite uncomfortable. But in the morning, it's generally quite easy to do that. And if you do 2 days, by the way, you maybe can have a little bit more flexibility. Instead of really, really making sure that you go to close to 12 grams per kilo body weight, you can be in that 8 to 12 gram per kilo body weight on those days. I wouldn't be afraid to go to 12 grams per kilo body weight. I have done that several times on 2-day carb loads and felt great. So it's not that you're going to get too much, but also you can have a bit, if you find that a struggle to get that amount, then maybe instead of having 1 day of 12 grams per kilo body weight of carbs, having 2 days of 9 to 10 grams would be is more feasible for you. And in addition to the carb load, obviously making sure that you eat things that will help you digest or that will help you prevent any kind of GI issues. So actually, when it comes to carb loading, a lot of the carbs, for me at least personally, everybody's individual here, but what I do and what I recommend is to get a lot of it from liquid sources. So one of them would be melted dextrin mixed with fructose, and then another one would be just plain and simple Coke, and then some very simple carbs like rice, jam, Haribos. Those are good sources and basically my go-tos. The fourth one that you can do, the fourth biggest gain that you can get in race week is bike prep. So make sure that a clean bike is a fast bike, right? Make sure that your bike is as fast as it can be, clean and shiny, waxed or lubed chain with great quality products, perfect gears and brakes, etc. So if you go from a really dirty and inefficient drivetrain to a really clean and fast one, that could easily be 10 watts saved. So that would be the fourth one. So yeah, as you can see, there's nothing you can do in training to gain performance on race day. There are definitely things that you can mess up, and the point about training in race week is to not mess things up, not do too much. But then there are things outside of training, sleep, nutrition, and bike prep that you can do to definitely make big gains on race day. Oh, and sorry, going back to the nutrition a little bit, one thing I should say is that, I already mentioned some of the carb sources that I would use in the 2 days before the race, but thinking about minimizing fiber, potentially minimizing things like lactose and gluten, not glucose, would be good to just minimize any risk of GI issue on race day. I think that, again, coming back to personally, what I do is that I try to not have any lactose in, especially the day before the race, even though I'm not lactose intolerant by any stretch. And same thing with gluten. I'm not gluten intolerant. I don't generally have any issues, but I just know that these are sources that for a lot of people, there might be a small impact that you might feel in the 8th hour of an Ironman that you wouldn't feel normally. And then those are the kinds of things that I would minimize. So fiber, lactose, and gluten. And of course, if you have things that you know that you tolerate less well than others, fats as well. Fats take longer to digest. So that's another thing that I would put on the things to really minimize or avoid in those 2 days before the race, to make sure that you're just giving yourself the maximum chance or minimum chance of having any kind of GI issues. By the way, I am terribly sorry for the scraping noises that you might have been able to just hear there in the background. Our neighbors are doing some kind of DIY, I think. But anyway, moving on to the next question, which is also from Henry. When is it better to race by feel, so using no data, and what types of athletes should do that, or should they? So firstly, one scenario where you should maybe use more data and rely more on data is if you find yourself consistently overpacing, so going too hard earlier in the race and then fading towards the back end. This is a scenario where if you are already using data, then you just need to reassess your plan because something is wrong with your plan. It's not realistic. But if you are maybe having data, but you're not using it, you're just following your feel, basically, then this is a scenario where you might need to rely a bit more on data and be a bit more strict on yourself with following a plan, even if you feel really good early on in the race. The opposite scenario that is that if you find yourself consistently crossing the finish line and wondering if you really, really squeezed everything out of yourself, or if you left something out there, that's when you might experiment with doing the opposite of what you're currently doing, meaning that if you are currently using data, you're following a good pacing strategy, it's clearly working well because you reach the finish line and you haven't overpaced yourself, you have stayed strong until the end. But maybe you are leaving something out there. So try to do a race without data, or at least not really using the data, and see how that goes. You may find yourself breaking boundaries and reaching a new level by just not having such a strict strategy or following the strategy so strictly. And maybe depending on your personality here, it might mean that you just don't have any data. Some people might be fine with having the data there, but just not following it, not adhering to it, not even having a strict pacing plan from the beginning, just seeing what comes out of you on the day. For others that might be difficult. You might automatically fall back to the pacing plan of your last race, and because you're maybe a bit afraid of pushing the boundaries. And in that case, you might have to just not use any data, and so you have to see what kind of personality, I guess, you are as an athlete, as a racer. But this is the scenario where I would consider not using data. But if you are again, in that scenario where you reach the finish line, not sure if you squeezed everything out of yourself, but you're currently just racing by feel, then your tendency might be to be a good pacer, but maybe a bit risk averse. So you might consider using data more than you are currently doing, maybe, and setting a slightly more aggressive pacing strategy simply for your next race, and try to stick to it, even if you feel that, oh, this is hard, but just try to stick to it. So you can, just use how you get to the end of the race, and what is the way that you get to the end of the race with, and see if there are, and basically change things if you think that there might be some optimization to do. There is another, I guess, more unusual scenario, but worth pointing out, and that is that if you're in the race to really, really race it, then racing without data might very well be the way to go. For example, let's say you're going to your local park run every week, you're consistently placing in the top 10, you're 7th, 9th, 6th, etc. But now your training has been going really well, and you want to make it onto the podium. So if that is the case, just leave the watch at home. Just put yourself on the start line, on the front line. Go with the pace that you need to go to be in that top 3 contention. Hang on for dear life. It will be really hard, but this is how you find breakthroughs. This is the reason that when you look at World Triathlon races, World Triathlon Championship Series, you don't see people running with watches generally. Almost nobody does it, because it's all about, you need to go with the speed of the race. You're just trying to hang on for dear life, beat the guy or beat the woman next to you, move up in the field if you're coming from behind. You're just using the other people around you, and you're using your feel. But the watch is of no use in those kinds of scenarios. So when you're trying to go for something like a podium or a really good performance, whatever that is, like racing other people, being in it as a race, then sometimes racing with no data makes a lot of sense. It's also worth pointing out, related to all of this, that for beginner athletes who don't have a lot of race experience, that racing with data and a conservative plan is generally a good thing, but then using that experience to calibrate your feel every time you race. That's what I would recommend. This is assuming, of course, that the athlete even has access to data, because a lot of beginners start out without having any devices. And that is totally fine. And then what you will do is just to have to learn to pace by feel, and you will make mistakes. It's a steep learning curve, but it will be an invaluable learning experience for the rest of your endurance sports career. You just have to be a bit reflective and think about your pacing after the fact. Okay, what did I do good? What can I improve on for the next time? And then you will, sooner rather than later, you will be pretty good at pacing yourself and being in tune with your body. For athletes, on the other hand, that have already accumulated a lot of racing experience, it is important to remember that even if you have data available to you during the race, it doesn't mean that you race with data rather than feel. It simply means that you race with data and feel, or maybe I should say feel and data, because even if you have a plan, it doesn't have to be set in stone. It shouldn't be set in stone. If you are experienced enough, you should change how you execute the plan if you really feel confident that, no, actually, based on how things are going here, I need to change my plan. And then time will tell whether that decision pays off or not. But that is how you learn. If it didn't pay off, and if it does pay off, then great, that is perfect race execution. The more experience you get, of course, the better you get at making these decisions, and the more experience you have of using of racing by feel and by data at the same time, and also reflecting on it after the fact, the better the chances that you will consistently make good decisions when you're in these situations. So yeah, that is, I would say, my answer to this question: when is it better to race by feel using no data? There are some scenarios, but in a lot of scenarios, it's about using both together, and not being rigidly focused on just one of the two, but having all of the tools available that you can. The next question is from Mikael, who asks, I have a question about testing. Evidently, tests need to be tailored to some degree, at least, to the event that is being prepared for. I am a road cyclist, so a classification of events might be crits shorter than 1 hour, long road races, 2 to 5 hours long. Subcategories of these road races might be races ending in a sprint, races with long hills, and also flatter one-off events versus stage races. What would be your chosen test metric for different events like these, and how often would you test? My personal preparation is for road races that are 2 to 5 hours long, not races, but that have long hills in them. All right. Thank you for the question, Michael. There are some tests that I would do with all cyclists, and those would include a critical power test. You can use a number of different combinations of durations, but generally I use a 3-minute time trial and a 20-minute time trial to calculate critical power. And I would use some kind of VO2 max proxy test. Generally, I use a ramp test, but you could also use a 5-minute time trial, and that could actually be part of your critical power battery. So if you want to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, maybe do a 5-minute test and a 20-minute test. Maybe you also want something a bit shorter than a 5-minute test. So you could still use a 2-minute test, 5-minute test, and 20-minute test or something like that. But then you would get a critical power test, and you get that VO2 max proxy from the 5-minute time trial. And I'm not saying a VO2 max proxy as in I'm not trying to calculate or estimate your VO2 max from it, because that's not interesting, but changes in that test in, let's say, a 5-minute time trial or in a ramp test like I use, those would generally be reflective of changes in VO2 max. And then the final test that would be a sprint test. So that could be a 10 to 20 second all-out test, and looking at both average power but also peak power produced and how quickly you get to that peak power. And these tests I like to do fairly early on after restarting training after a season break. So this might be in, let's say, November. Then I would look to retest a couple of months later. And from there, it really depends on what the racing schedule looks like. So if this is an athlete racing a lot, they might not repeat those tests again at all throughout the season, because the priority is not testing, but is performing in races. And to some extent, you might be able to even use your racing data to assess your critical power. And also maybe, you can have your 5-minute mean max power from races and compare that to the 5-minute time trials or 5-minute tests if you have used that in your testing battery. So you can use some race data depending on the races that you're doing, of course. And this is assuming that you're getting all-out efforts in those races. And I would probably not do any other tests than these. So you're asking for specific tests tailored for the events. I generally don't do that, but what I do, of course, is specific race preparation workouts that simulate the race demands. And because these workouts are usually rather hard, it is like a test in itself. Training is testing, so to say. Also, if you make sure that you use the same structure for these race-specific workouts, the next time you're preparing for a race of a similar kind, then you will be able to compare where you are now compared to where you were then. So since you are using the same race specific workouts, or at least very similar workouts. So this is what I do. It's not about having formal tests, let's say. It's about having workouts that simulate the race and prepare you for the race. So for example, for a crit, your specific workouts would include repeated high-intensity efforts, and you might progress these by extending the duration of your sets where you have high-intensity efforts, and the recovery between high-intensity efforts is still solid. It might be tempo riding. It might be 10 seconds of coasting and then riding at tempo, or at least riding at tempo or so, and then just repeating really high efforts. And your progression might be to decrease the recoveries between those high intensity efforts, or it might be to extend the duration of the entire set, or maybe decrease the recoveries between sets. There are a number of things that you could go about this, but that would be just roughly an outline for what the specific preparation workouts would look like. For a flat road race with a sprint finish, I'd look to do a long solid ride. This would depend on the duration of the race, of course. So generally some kind of tempo, but maybe you have some threshold intervals thrown in there, even something above threshold. So basically race simulation efforts scattered in throughout the ride, and then towards the end, try to simulate the final few kilometers of the race. So obviously you can't simulate the scrambling for position, but try to simulate the intensity. So how the power really goes as high as you can, essentially. And trying to hold that really high power for a few minutes for those few kilometers where it's really hard. And then if, depending on your role in the team, of course, you would also try to, that would culminate in you simulating a lead out or the sprint itself, the final sprint for the line. So that would be the race specific workout for a road race with a sprint finish. For a hilly road race, you would do the long ride as above with race specific efforts, and the duration again would kind of match the race you're doing, or at least approach it. But then towards the end of the ride, instead of those few kilometers, a couple of kilometers, 3 kilometers of a few minutes essentially of really, really hard effort, you would finish with a longer hard effort, and of course on a climb, as long if you have climbs of that sort around you. So it might not mean doing a 1 hour climb if your race will finish on a 1 hour climb, but at least do a 30-minute climb or a 20-minute climb, and maybe progress that from starting at 15 minutes and try to progress all the way to 30 to 40 minutes as your final, like really, really hard peak workout. So that would be a hilly or road race with a hilltop finish or a mountain finish. And of course, some of you may ask if you should do formal durability testing or fatigue resistance testing, like doing a workout of 2,000 kilojoules, 3,000 kilojoules, and then doing 20 minutes all out, or even doing a 20-minute fresh test and then doing it again after 2,000 kilojoules. But I don't do that. It's actually something we talked about recently with Mikael and Zanini, that for testing, let's say, durability, you'd want to make it very specific to the event that you're preparing for. And these workouts that I give an examples of, at least these road race workouts, would be perfect examples of, they are essentially durability tests, but they are specifically designed to that goal event. So that's why I wouldn't do any more formal and, let's say, sterile and boring durability testing, but it would really be training is testing in that sense. So I hope that this helps. I guess it's a matter of perspective, really. I might see this as training, but you could see it as testing equally well, because you would want to repeat the same workouts, or at least very similar workouts, when you do a similar build for a similar event again at a different time point. So in a way, it definitely is testing. Training is testing. All right, and the next question, I don't have the name of the person asking, sorry, but the question is, can you recommend a self-test protocol based on heart rate for comparing running shoes? So yes, that is actually a very good question and very relevant now that there are a lot of super shoes out there and a lot of people want to figure out what is the fastest shoe for me. We're getting more educated with realizing that there are differences between shoes, and they might not, what works best for one person might not work best for the other person. It's generally not the case that the shoe that is the fastest for one person will be the slowest for another person. There are definitely overlaps, but the shoe that is the first and the second fastest for one person might be the second and the fastest for another person. So just to give you an idea, it's not you don't have to turn everything on its head and think that, well, just because everybody else is using these shoes, they could equally be worthless for me. That's probably not the case, but they might not be the absolute fastest shoe. Anyway, so the testing protocol, you would, of course, bring all of your shoes that you want to test to the test. And I really, really recommend doing this test on a treadmill, just because that gives you the best control, not only with speed, but also with conditions, because you could do it in an air-conditioned gym or at home if you have a treadmill, but you could control for environmental conditions. And of course, speed takes care of itself because you just set that on treadmill. Obviously, you would then want to do it if you repeat tests later on, and you want to compare between tests, then you would need to do it on the same treadmill ideally, but generally that is not necessarily the most important thing, because anytime you're testing shoes, you would want to know, okay, of these 2 pairs of shoes that I have, which ones should I use in my next race or my next couple of races. So let's say for this example that we have 2 pairs of shoes that we want to compare. I'm just going to use, in this example, we're comparing Nikes and Asics shoes, just for an example. The first thing you would want to do, and you can use another pair of shoes or one of the pairs that you're going to test, it doesn't matter, for a good warm-up, and that warm-up is supposed to, at the end, raise your heart rate quite significantly. So you want, basically the test speed will be around your marathon pace for faster runners, half marathon pace for slower runners. What is faster, what is slower? Let's say if you're a 3-hour marathoner or close to 3-hour marathoner, 3:10, something like that, then you can use a marathon pace. If you're slower than that for the marathon, then, I mean, you're still fast, don't get me wrong, but this is just to give an indication. Then you can use half marathon pace, maybe if you're more closer to 3:30 than 3:15 at least, let's say, then I would suggest half marathon pace for a testing pace. Let's say we're a 3-hour marathoner exactly. That means that we're running at 14 kilometers an hour or 4 minutes 15 per kilometer, or it means 8.7-ish, as I believe, miles per hour, or 7-15, 720 minutes per mile, minutes and seconds per mile, something in that range. You can do the conversion. It doesn't matter. I'm going to use 14 kilometers an hour. Obviously, when you're on the treadmill, most of them show pace, but they also show kilometers an hour or miles per hour. So just let's keep it at 14 kilometers an hour. That's our testing pace. We're going to do a good warm-up, let's say 20 minutes. And the final 6 minutes, 5-6 minutes, we would do at that testing pace. So 14 kilometers an hour, 3-hour marathon pace. Just to make sure that we do a significant duration of work at our testing pace to already start to get our heart rate to respond as if we were doing the test, so that the first test is not significantly different from the second, third, and fourth, and so on, because that would be, that is what it's going to be if we just go from easy running to then doing testing at marathon pace. So as part of the warm-up, you need to finish with doing a significant amount of work at your testing speed. Then we're going to do 2 tests per pair of shoe. Again, we're only testing 2 pairs of shoes now, so we're going to do 4 tests in total. Each test is 5 minutes, and we're taking 5-minute recoveries between each test. This gives us time to change shoes, obviously, but also to fully let the heart rate recover, and more. It gives us more than enough time to let the heart recover, but it just makes sure that we're starting from a blank slate, not each time. I mean, there will be maybe a little bit of fatigue accumulation, but that's why we also test twice per shoe. So what we're going to do is we're going to test first the Nikes, then we're testing the Asics, then we're testing the Asics again, and finally we're testing the Nikes again, so that we don't have, if we only test once per shoe, then there is going to be a small impact of things like core temperature rising, maybe even slight fatigue accumulation. It's not a fair test. To set up a really fair test, and this is how it's done in research, we need to do what is called a counterbalanced test. So that is why we're testing these shoes twice per pair and doing that in the counterbalanced order. So 5 minutes at marathon pace or half marathon pace with each pair of shoe. We're making sure that we're collecting the data. We're recording our heart rate, and of course we know we're taking note of the speed as well. But the speed is going to be the same in each test, and we make sure not to touch it. So we keep it at this 14 kilometers an hour, 3-hour marathon pace in this example. Right. So I'm going to do the test 5 minutes with the Nikes, then I step off the treadmill, take 5 minutes recovery, during which time I change to the Asics shoes. Again, run 5 minutes with the Asics at the same speed, keep the data running, keep the data recording, step off the treadmill for 5 minutes recovery, and keep the shoes on, and do a second test with the Asics. So this is test number 3, but it is test number 2 with the Asics shoes. And again, 5 minutes off after that test, and then finally changing to the Nike shoes again, and we're doing the final 5 minute test with the Nikes. So we had Nike, Asics, Asics, Nike. And then we go home and we upload the data and we look at the heart rate for each test. And I like to take the final 2 minutes of each 5-minute test. This is the data I use because sometimes heart rate can just take quite a while to respond and stabilize. The last 3 minutes would also be okay generally because 2 minutes should be enough for marathon pace or half marathon pace, but I would rather be safe than sorry, so I take the last 2 minutes and skip the first 3 minutes. So I'm just going to use example numbers here. Let's say the first test with the Nikes, we averaged 141 beats per minute for the last 2 minutes. We note that down. Then the last 2 minutes with the Asics, test 1 was 143, test 2 was 144, and then the final test with the Nikes, the average heart rate for the last 2 minutes was 142. Then we average these heart rate numbers for each shoe. So for the Nikes, we average 141 and 142. We get 141.5. And for the Asics, we average 143 and 144. And we get 143.5. So we have a difference in 2 beats per minute. And from what I've seen, I've done this testing, and I've also compared this to actually testing in the lab with running economy measurements. 2 beats per minute is significant. This is where you can maybe, it doesn't look like much, but we're at least talking about a minute, or a marathon, we might be talking 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes. It's nothing to be snuffed at really. So yeah, even if you see a 1 beat per minute difference, then at that case, in that situation, you might think that, okay, yeah, this is really small, so maybe I'm not too certain about my results. But when you see 2 beats per minute, then that's already in my opinion a pretty good indication of which shoe is the best for you. So yeah, you take the shoe that gives you the lowest heart rate for that identical speed that you test at, and this is it. This is how you would do a self-test protocol based on heart rate for comparing running shoes. The gold standard would still be to go into a lab and obviously do it with running economy testing, but I think that this is a good test, and for most people, not all, it will be sufficient to find which is the best shoe for you, especially if you're only comparing 2 pairs of shoes. But you need to do it really properly, the way that I described. There are lots of mistakes that could be made when testing shoes, and you could get false results basically if you don't set up the test well. So that is important. Okay, so the next question is from Vesa, who asks, how do I know my Fatmax watts and how to train in the best way in that zone? So I'm really not aware of any evidence that says that there's anything special about training at Fatmax or in the Fatmax zone. In fact, there's one study, I'll link to it. It's called Limited Benefits of Fatmax-Test to Derive Training Prescriptions by Schwindling in 2013. They took 16 trained to well-trained cyclists, determined their Fatmax, and then had them cycle for 1 hour at Fatmax, and then and in separate sessions, 1 hour at significantly below Fatmax and 1 hour at significantly above Fatmax. So those intensities in power were 210 watts for Fatmax and 173 watts for the step below and 248 watts for the step above. And fat oxidation was measured during each of those sessions. And what they found was that fat oxidation was the same across all 3 sessions, or there were no significant differences, even though power and also heart rate and lactate levels were very, very different. So Fatmax, as we know it at least today, is a very blunt instrument and not one that I would put a lot of stock in. That's not to say that it's bad to train there. I mean, it is the top end of, or generally speaking, you could describe it as the top end of your zone 2 in a 5-zone system, or if the top end of the moderate intensity domain in the moderate, heavy, and severe model. So and it's not. I do prescribe training in that area, but it's more so to, if we don't have a lot of really hard training to recover from, then some of the endurance training can be done with a little bit of spice, so to say. And that's where, for me at least, in a coaching perspective, Fatmax training comes in, even though I never would call it Fatmax training. I just call it something like endurance plus or something like that is what I would tend to describe that as. But yeah, it's not something that I would aim for to look specifically at Fatmax to train there. Like if you have a rough ideas of your zones in a 5-zone system, then yeah, there is a time and place to train in zone 1 and in zone 2 and at the high end of zone 2. You just don't want to necessarily think that any one point is better than the other. It's the entirety of your program that is important, really, and that is what will make you better. But yeah, to go a little bit deeper, I think that Fatmax is a blunt instrument. I said that already, I think, but in the study that I referenced before, Fatmax was assessed with a step test. So the steps were 6-minute long stages. But usually if you go to a lab and just ask for them to measure your Fatmax, then they will do a ramp test with an incremental test with significantly shorter steps. Often they would be 1-minute steps or 30-second steps or something like that. But you would reach exhaustion pretty quickly, maybe after 10 minutes, 12 minutes, something like that. And this is a great protocol for finding your VO2 max. But the labs will also use that test to assess your ventilatory thresholds and even your Fatmax and your fat and carb oxidation at different intensities. The problem with this is that there is never any time to find a steady state if you're using short steps. So these parameters that do require a steady state to be reliable, you should never get them from a testing protocol where the steps are shorter than, I think, 3 minutes would be the absolute shortest. So this is something to be to keep in mind, that even if Fatmax was important, we would need to pay a lot of attention to how we measure it, because the Fatmax that you might get in a lab report based on a ramp test with, let's say, 1-minute steps, that's probably not a super accurate Fatmax anyway. So yeah, to summarize, I don't think there's any reason for you to need to know your Fatmax nor your maximum fat oxidation rate. There's no evidence that I'm aware of that training in that zone is better than training at any other intensity. I am pretty sure that if we did a study where we had 2 groups and one of the groups, or we could have a crossover design, and we had people do 3 high intensity sessions per week for a few weeks or months, and or usually most studies are weeks, so let's say weeks, and the other group trained at Fatmax for the equivalent amount of kilojoules, so we match for energy, then the high intensity group would improve their fat oxidation more than the Fatmax group would, simply because they would improve their VO2 max more. Does that mean that high intensity training is the best way to improve fat oxidation? No, it doesn't. It's just a sign of the fact that a rising tide lifts all boats. So improving your endurance overall, in this example through VO2 max improvement, that will also improve your fat oxidation. So yeah, I don't think there's any convincing evidence of there being shortcuts or gimmicks or secrets, tips and tricks. Fatmax, I think, just rises with increased endurance, increased fitness. Train a lot, most of it pretty easy, some of it pretty hard, recover well, and that's it. That's how you will maximize your Fatmax. So again, I'm not saying that you shouldn't train there, but you don't. There's no zone that you need to avoid. There's no gray zone, but it's all about the overall structure of your program, and you do not need to know your Fatmax. So let's move on to the next question. And again, I've lost the name for who asks this test, or who asked this question, sorry. But the question anyway is, I really struggle in tests that are not races. So for example, a local 5-kilometer run. Should I therefore just race more? So yeah, this is a great question. I 100% understand the reluctance to do tests that are not races when it comes to running specifically. Actually, you don't mention if this is only running or if you just struggle in tests in general. But my experience as a coach is that for a lot of people, running is much worse to do tests in, time trial tests in, than cycling and swimming. So personally, I prescribe as little run testing as possible, and especially my advanced athletes would basically never do something like a running time trial. If they do testing on the run, it would be a lactate test if that's accessible, and otherwise it would be a race, as you say, a 5K or a 10K race. But regarding whether you should race more and in that way test more, I would say that it depends. So yeah, let me expand upon that. You don't necessarily have to race more. I do coach a couple of athletes, for example, that haven't done a running race nor any run testing in ages. But similarly to the cycling test question that we had before, remember that workouts are also a sort of testing. So if you can do the same workout but at an easier RPE, that's a sign of progress. And it can also be a signal to add a couple of reps to the workout, or to do it a bit quicker next time, depending on the nature of the workout. So you don't need to do a one-off test necessarily to get a specific idea of exactly what paces you should be running at in training, or whether your training is going well. Your workouts will tell you. They will tell you if you're going better than you went before. They will tell you if it is time to start to add a little bit more stimulus by adding more reps, or even going a bit faster. So don't get me wrong. I do think that doing 5K and 10K races is great. It adds value. So if you do like these races, then I don't think there's much downside in doing them, and there is maybe some upside. So I would recommend doing them, but I also wouldn't do them if you find that even doing local races is a bit of a struggle, and it's basically emptying your mental tank a little bit, and you want to keep that mental tank filled up for the triathlon races that you're really targeting. So I think that's what it comes down to, really. If you can easily do them without struggling mentally, or if you would have to kind of force yourself to do these kinds of local 5K and 10K races. But if you can, if it's not a problem for you and you like it, then yeah, I think it's great. And especially during the winter, I would recommend doing some 5K and 10K races. I would say that for a more beginner athlete, or somebody that, not necessarily even beginner, but somebody who hasn't yet developed a really good sense of pacing, then I would be more inclined to strongly recommend doing some races, unless they're doing testing. So then it would be a bit more, then I would be a bit more prone to recommend it, I would say, to also be able to, in addition to, let's say, telling them that, okay, this workout should be done at 10K effort, but I would also give a pace range if it's somebody that I know isn't quite as in tune with their pacing as they will be later on in their career. So that's something to keep in mind, that depending on your sense of pacing and how in tune you are with your running ability, that will influence basically how important it would be to do a test or a race, which would act as a test. I should also say that when we talk about doing more races as testing, for 5K and 10K races, I think that's brilliant. Because they are good as tests. They are good as training stimulus, because you couldn't push yourself that hard in a workout, but you can also recover from these efforts quickly. So there are a lot of upsides to doing them, but that's not so much the case when we go to races like a half marathon, or especially a full marathon, obviously. Then the downsides become quite a lot more significant. So that's something you have to really keep in mind, that when we're talking about running races here, I'm generally talking about 5K and 10K races to use as tests, and nothing longer than that. Or maybe we could stretch it to 10 miles, but that would be it. And that would also depend on how fast you are. But yeah, in summary, to wrap up, if you are an experienced athlete with a good sense of pacing and effort, and you or your coach design your training so that it in itself provides a measure of progress monitoring, then you don't have to race more to use these races as test data. That being said, there aren't many downsides of doing it if the tests are not too long, or the races are not too long, I should say. So provided you enjoy racing, then it wouldn't be a bad thing to incorporate them in your training. If you're still working on your sense of pace and effort, then racing is a huge part of that learning curve, and then I would really strongly recommend doing more races as part of that learning curve, and also to get that additional data point to, I guess, that will help you execute your training better as well. So yeah, that's in summary. I hope that helps. The next question is from Sam, who's asking for the best swim test for a 713/Ironman athlete to assist with programming in 10 cities. So I talked about this in quite some detail in the swim training Q&A. I will try to remember to link to it in the show notes. And the testing that I use for swimming is a critical speed test that consists of a 100, a 400, and a 1900 meter time trial. The 1900 would be on a separate day, the 100 and 400 on the same day. This is with the assumption that your 1900 meter time is not much slower than around 30 minutes. If you're closer to 40 minutes, then I probably wouldn't use a long test like that. Then I would shorten it significantly, maybe to at most 1500 meters or something. But I recommend listening to that swim training Q&A for a detailed breakdown of why I like this test. But as a brief summary, it gives you a more realistic reflection of what your sustainable intensity or your quote-unquote threshold is versus a test with only short time trials like the very popular 400 plus 200 test. I do think that tends to overestimate the paces in a lot of athletes. In addition to that, in addition to getting a more accurate reflection of threshold, the 100 meter is a shorter test, so it allows you to better assess your top end speed. You might even use a 50 if you want to. But the 400 also gives you a good target pace for when you're doing really fast VO2 max type swim workouts. So there's a lot of advantages to using this combination, the 100, 400, 1900. I've kind of come to this after experimenting with a lot of different setups, and I'm sure that at some point in the future I will change again. Nothing is forever, right? But for now, I'm really happy with this compared to anything that I tested before, at least. And one other note on the critical speed test is that calculating critical speed from three different time trials is simple, but you generally won't find any calculators online for it. So you have to do it yourself in Excel or Google Sheets. Basically, you would convert your pace for each time trial to your speed in meters per second. And then you would plot that speed against the inverse of time. So you would be plotting meters per second against 1 per second. Meters per second on the y-axis, 1 per second on the x-axis. So let's say for argument's sake that you swim your 100 meter in 60 seconds to make the math easy. Then on the x-axis you would not put 60 seconds, but you would put 1 divided by 60, whatever that is, 0 point something something. So in Excel or Google Sheet, you would make a regression line with the 3 data points, and the intercept of that regression line is your CS, so where it intercepts the y-axis. This will be in meters per second, so you need to convert it back to pace again. And it sounds complicated, but it really is very simple if you have a little bit of Excel experience. But in addition to this as a test, make sure that you have a proper race-specific workout progression planned for whether it's a 713 or an Ironman build that you're doing. The nice thing about the swim for age groupers in particular in 713 and Ironman is that it's short enough and it's not super intense because you still have to bike and run for a long time. So it's very feasible and advisable even to simulate the entire swim in training. So for example, for a 713, you could start your progression of workouts by doing 5x400 at 713 effort with 1 minute recovery. And you should be able to pace all the 400s evenly or even with a negative split. So by that I mean the final 400 should be as fast as the first one, and then still finish feeling that you're fresh enough to jump onto the bike right away. So it's not a best effort workout, far from it, in fact. And you can build to doing a 1900 meter continuous race pace effort, and that is something that I think there's a lot of value to doing, even though a lot of people we don't normally do it. But I'm more and more coming to that conclusion that that's something that we benefit from implementing those sorts of workouts for swimming in specifically. And for the full Ironman, you could start with your progression with something like 5x800 or 4x1000 and build to the full 3800 meter continuous. The same thing applies here with pacing and effort. You should feel that you have even more left in the tank compared to the 713 workout, as obviously you have twice the distance of biking and running still to do. So you have to hold back even more. So even if you decide that, I'm not going to bother with doing that critical speed test that Mikael recommends, you can still use specific workout progressions like these, and they will help you dial in your effort level and prepare you physically and mentally for executing your swim on race day. What these progressions won't tell you, nor no test will tell you what will your race time be. The best thing that you can do for that would be to do an open water race of the same distance. But then still, it's all conditional upon race conditions, so currents, waves, salt water versus fresh water and so on. But training in the pool is very different than swimming in the open water in terms of the speeds that you will hold. So you can't predict your race time necessarily from these progressions. But what you can do is that you can compare the splits that you did prior to one race with now that you're in your next race build. You can compare what you did in your prior race build, and if you see that, okay, my times now in these same workouts are better, then that's a sign that, yeah, I have improved. And no matter how fast you swim on race day, because that might not be faster because of conditions simply, you are very likely, if you have improved your fitness, to at least place higher in your age group in the swim. So yeah, this gives you the tools to see, am I likely to move up the pack in the swim or not compared to what I have in the past, even though you can't predict your swim time in the race from that. So yeah, that's in summary what I would say for swim tests and swim workout progressions for 7.3/Ironman athletes. By the way, one thing I want to point out, a general point, because in several of these questions, the swim one and the bike question as well earlier, I talked about these specific race-specific workouts. Obviously, when you're training, you're not only doing race-specific workouts, nor are you only doing race-specific workouts, and the rest of the workouts are endurance or easy workouts. There's definitely other intensities that you might implement, and this would depend on a lot of factors, but you might do higher intensities or you might do lower intensities, and mix of all sorts of things really. But in those final weeks, month or a couple of months before a race, you will do a fair amount. The emphasis will be more on the race specific workouts, and then there might still be some other ones, but the highest priority goes to the race specific workouts. And so when I'm talking about these, do not misunderstand me to say that these are the only key workouts that you're doing or the only hard workouts that you're doing, but they are among the most important ones. So that's something that I just wanted to make clear. All right, so let's take the final question for today, and this is a long one. This one is from Adam, who asks, I just re-listened to your podcast episodes with Mikael Rosenblatt, episode number 244, and I wanted to ask about Maximum Aerobic Power and how I could test this at home on the bike trainer. What would your advice be on designing a workout utilizing the bike trainer to test my MAP, my Max Aerobic Power? My plan was to do a ramp that progresses by 10 to 15 watts every 2 minutes. Firstly, what is your opinion on this protocol, and would you change it? Secondly, what would be your exit criteria for the test? Would it be a drop in set cadence, a heart rate reading, exertion, or unable to complete the entire 2 minutes? All right, thanks Adam for the question. So let's first do a quick summary so that everybody's on the same page. Maximum aerobic power, MAP, basically here means the maximum power that you sustain in a graded exercise test / incremental test / ramp test. There are many terms used for this one thing. And this could be defined as the power of the final completed step in a ramp test, or sometimes it could be, you could apply a correction factor so that it accounts for a partially completed stage. More colloquially, I would say, among athletes and coaches, MAP is often used as simply the peak 1 minute power of a ramp test. In the scientific literature, I think there is a trend to move away from the term MAP and also similarly MAV, maximum aerobic velocity for running, and to start to use the term WMAX, which is the maximum work rate achieved in an incremental test. Because like many older terms that we use in exercise physiology, maximum aerobic power is just very misleading. It's not a great term. WMAX, maximum work rate, makes a lot more sense because that is literally what it is in that testing protocol. But let's see, I'll probably use WMAX and MAP interchangeably continuing on, because frankly, I am personally used to using the term MAP, and it will probably take me some time to change. And so you will probably hear MAP from me, and what I mean with it is generally the highest 1 minute power that you achieve at the end of a ramp test. So MAP or WMAX is very well correlated with VO2 max, your maximum aerobic capacity. You've heard guests on this podcast, you've heard me previously in this episode recommend a 5-minute test, because an improvement in your performance in a 5-minute test is likely to be the result of a change in VO2 max. And the same is true for your MAP or your WMAX. A change in your WMAX is a good indicator of a change in VO2 max. So even if you don't know your VO2 max because you're only testing at home on your trainer, you can have a pretty good idea of if you have improved your VO2 max or not. And I would say that MAP or WMAX is more interesting than VO2 max, actually, because MAP is determined by your VO2 max and by your gross efficiency. So in theory, you could have a great VO2 max, but a poor gross efficiency. And then despite your superior VO2 max, your power output might be the same in a ramp test or in a race as somebody with a more modest VO2 max. So power is really the more relevant at the end of the day. Power is more related to speed than VO2 max, and speed is how you get from the start line to the finish line. So yeah, this is why MAP is just as good, if not a better performance indicator than VO2 max, at least in my opinion. And MAP is always derived from some kind of ramp test, incremental test, graded exercise test. But what's really important to know is that what number you get out at the end of the test is very, very dependent on the design of that ramp, and specifically on the slope of the ramp. The slope basically means how many watts per second or watts per minute does the intensity increase by. So you could have, for example, one protocol where the power increases by 25 watts every minute, and then another protocol where the power increases by 25 watts every 3 minutes. Let's say that your threshold is at 300 watts. This means that by the time you get to the 350 watt stage, in protocol 1, you have just spent the 2 prior minutes at 325 watts and 300 watts respectively, so at and above threshold. But in the second protocol with the 3-minute stages, you have spent the 6 prior minutes at 3 of them at 325 watts, 3 of them at 300 watts. Obviously, by the time you get to the 350 watt stage, you are already a lot more fatigued in protocol 2 than in protocol 1. And you will fatigue more quickly, basically, and reach a lower peak power. You will reach a lower stage of the protocol when the slope of the ramp is lower. For this reason, you accumulate more fatigue because you spend more time at each power. To give you a very specific example from research, there have been many studies, but one that I found was that looked at different protocols, and the MAP that was achieved or the WMAX that was achieved when the graded exercise test protocol or the ramp test protocol went from a really steep slope of 50 watts per minute to a really shallow slope of 8 watts per minute. The duration of the test increased on average from 7 minutes to 30 minutes long. So that's a massive increase in duration, a 4 times longer test. And the WMAX dropped by 108 watts. So it was 108 watts lower with the shallower slope and the longer protocol than it was with the steeper slope and the shorter protocol. So this is a very, very important point here. Never compare your MAP or your WMAX between different testing protocols, especially if there is a difference in slope. If the protocol is different but the slope is the same, for example, if you compare protocol A, which is increasing power by 20 watts every minute, or protocol B that is increasing power by 40 watts every 2 minutes, then these differences will probably be quite small, possibly statistically insignificant. But when there is a slope difference, you're really comparing apples to oranges, and therefore, no matter what protocol you use, make sure that you choose one protocol and stick to it so you're making valid comparisons. Because the actual number is completely dependent on the protocol. So the number itself doesn't matter so much. It's the changes in the number that are interesting when you're doing these tests for yourself. All right, so I hope that is clear. But let's then look at how it matters, how the design of the protocol matters, how you should design your protocol, and the considerations that exist. So consideration 1, I think, is that when you do testing in a lab where you're also measuring VO2, in this scenario, usually you want a shorter protocol, at least if you're also testing recreational athletes or less fit athletes, because in this population, the athlete might actually fatigue before they reach VO2 max if they do a longer protocol, so a shallower ramp or a lower ramp. Research has shown that generally well-trained athletes do reach VO2 max even with longer protocols. And of course, at home on your trainer, you're not measuring VO2 max anyway or VO2, so it doesn't matter at all. But if you're more of a beginner athlete and you ever go into a lab and they provide a test protocol that takes you 20 to 25 minutes to complete, that, in my opinion, is a sign that the lab technicians chose the wrong protocol. Because, generally, I would say that the protocol should take the athlete to exhaustion in not much more than 10 minutes for a beginner athlete to make sure that VO2 max was attained. Again, for well-trained athletes, this is not much of a consideration. And it's not an important consideration at all if you're not measuring VO2 anyway, but only measuring power in a home-based test. But one thing, since you referenced the episode with Michael Rosenblatt, he was arguing for doing these very shorter protocols, making sure that that you reach exhaustion pretty quickly within 12 minutes, I think is what he talks about. But I think that a big part of his argument is related to being able to compare a WMAX results across different studies. That is not your concern as an individual self-coached athlete. You don't need to concern yourself with that. So I don't think that it's necessary to have that short protocol constraint on you for that particular reason. There is another reason that we will get to next. And this is that one of the advantages of a shorter protocol, so a steeper slope, is that the test is quick and does not induce as much fatigue. You might even do a workout after the test and after recovering, some active recovery after the ramp, and then you can go into a workout, some tempo riding, for example, or even a bit of threshold work. So that is a big advantage of using a shorter protocol. If you're doing a ramp that takes you 25 minutes, then that might just be a bit too much to be able to do any kind of workout after that. And it might even take something out of you for the next day, or at least the next session on the same day. So recovery is a concern there, or something to consider at least. The third thing to consider is that if we are also considering sub-maximal parameters like taking lactate samples and measuring ventilation, these variables will not reach a steady state if we're doing a ramp test with just 1 minute steps. So this is where something like 3 minute steps might be a good compromise, where you can get to at least close to a steady state for these parameters, but you still have the slope of the ramp steep enough that you don't fatigue too soon just from the duration of the test. I did shorten your question a bit, by the way, but I know in the original question you said that you don't use lactate. So for you, obviously ventilation you don't use without the specialized equipment of a lab. So for you, the point of the MAP test really is to assess whether your training resulted in change in VO2 max. So you don't really need to think about these sub-maximal variables at all. So you don't need to. That's not a reason to go for longer stages at all, that you need to look at sub-maximal variables. You don't. So that's not a consideration for you, but for some other people in some situations, it might be a consideration. And the final consideration is that, which is quite an interesting one, I have read some research indicating that a longer protocol is more sensitive to pick up smaller changes in fitness. So in other words, if you pick a high slope, like 30 watts per minute, you might not see any changes in your MAP if your true fitness improvements exist, but they were small and subtle. But you might see changes in the MAP if you're using a lower slope, shallower slope, like 15 watts per minute. I don't think there's a lot of research on this, but at least one study exists that I've seen that shows this. So it is an interesting consideration that, a slightly shallower slope there could be more sensitive to pick up small changes in fitness. So as you can see, there is no one right answer for what the best protocol is. You're always making trade-offs when deciding on your protocol, and you have to decide which factors are important to you and be aware of the trade-offs you are willing to make. But one example that I'm sure a lot of people will wonder about is the Swift ramp test. The Swift ramp test has a slope of 20 watts per minute. So the step length is exactly 1 minute, and every minute the power increases by 20 watts. This, in my opinion, is a good protocol. Lots of labs and lots of research papers use this exact same slope, or a slope that is very similar. my very subjective impression, without any kind of systematic investigation, is that in a lot of the scientific literature, slopes of 20 to 25 watts per minute are really common. So the Swift test is a good test for finding your MAP or your WMAX. It is terrible as a threshold test, but that is a very different story. So you can very safely use that to test your MAP. And I would think that's a very good one to use. Your suggested protocol, to give some feedback on that, increasing 10 to 15 watts every 2 minutes. That is a long test with a low slope, to my mind. That's 5 to 7.5 watts per minute. So might put you closer to 40, 45 minutes for the test duration. I would personally prefer something a lot shorter. When I prescribe ramp tests, I tend to do something very similar to Swift, but I tend to use actually 25 watts per minute increases instead of 20 watts per minute increases, just to get the test over with quickly, minimize the recovery time and how much it takes out of you. And it works well even for beginner athletes because there is no fatigue from the duration. So I can always use the same test with all my athletes. I'm not using the MAP test anyway for sub-maximal markers that require a steady state. I'm not using it for lactate, ventilation, heart rate. So I don't care about that. That is why I use 1 minute stages with 25 watts per minute increases. But what you choose comes down to what you want to get out of the test. I would suggest, though, that your suggested protocol has too shallow of a slope. There's no reason to have that shallow of a slope in my mind. And finally, as for the exit criteria or stop criteria for the test, I would have very few of them. I would basically just pedal as long as you possibly can. The only thing that you might have in addition to just until your legs literally can't turn the pedal over anymore would be when your cadence drops below, let's say, 60 or maybe even 70, depending on what your normal cadence is. Let's say your normal cadence is 90, then I would say maybe you can have 70 as your exit criteria. But if your normal cadence is more in the 80 range, then you could have 60 as an exit criteria. But when you're at that point of really just grinding, at that point you can also consider it. But that will generally happen when you're too fatigued to continue anyway. So I just think that you continue until you can't continue anymore. That's really as simple as it needs to be, even though I know that in research studies and in labs and so on, they do have additional exit criteria. I just don't think that that's needed. You just go on until you can't go on anymore would be the main one. I hope that you enjoyed this Q&A. As always, you can find the show notes for the episode on scientifictriathlon.com. And I have quite a number of links, both some related episodes that we mentioned, were interviews with other guests, also a handful of studies that are related to some topics that we discussed. So, for example, on respiratory training, Fatmax testing, incremental exercise test design. And those were the main ones that I put in there. Maybe something else that I will think about later on. But lots of links for those that want to dig deeper. If you want to improve your triathlon performance and level up to achieve your next goal, there's probably no single better thing that you can do than get some expert help along the way. And at Scientific Triathlon, we provide coaching services that cater to every need from beginners to professionals, where the athlete is in the center, the coaching is grounded in communication and individualization, and the coaches all have a wealth of experience, knowledge, and coaching skills. If coaching is out of your budget or not for you, we also have ready-made training plans for different athlete levels and goal events, and hundreds, if not thousands of athletes have already set big PBs and reached new performance levels with these plans. They also have exchange and or money-back guarantees, so it's a risk-free investment. You can find out all about our coaching, training plans, customized training plans, and consultation options on scientifictriathlon.com. And to discuss your options, you can email me on michael@scientifictriathlon.com. Finally, big thanks to our sponsors Form that you can find on formswim.com/TTS. Improve your swim training with real-time metrics like pace, stroke rate, and heart rate, and advanced post-swim analysis. Use the code TTS15 to get 15% off the Form Smart Swim goggles. And thank you to Zen8. Use the Zen8 swim trainer to improve your technique, power, and swim training consistency. Even if you have just 15 minutes at home available, you can get a time-efficient Zen8 workout done at home that will help you swim better and stronger. You can try the Zen8 risk-free for up to 30 days and get 20% off your first order on zen8swimtrainer.com/TTS. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.